Morning, page 276. Meanwhile, the germ of freedom was spreading. Where, though, could it go from the archipelago? Just as the Dubovka prisoners had once thought it to us, had once brought it to us, so our comrades now carried it farther. That spring you could see this inscription written, scratched, or chiseled on every lavatory wall in Kazakhstan. Hail to the fighters of Akabatsus. The first culling of this center mutineers, about 40 men, and the 250 most hardened cases among the Big Friday transport were taken all the way to Kangir. The settlement was called Kangir, and the state Jezkazgan. This was the 3rd Steppe Camp Division, where the Steppe administration and the big-bellied Colonel Ch11 in person were to be found. The other Akabatsus prisoners to be punished were shared between the 1st and 2nd Divisions of Steppe Rudnik. To warn them off, the 8,000 Zeks of Kangir were informed that the new arrivals were bandits. They were marched all the way from the station to Kangir jail's new building in handcuffs. In this way, like a legend in chains, our movement entered still servile Kangir to awaken it to. Here, as in Akabatsus a year back, the bully and the informer still reigned supreme. When he had kept our 40,000 in jail till April, the commander of the Kangir Camp Division, Lieutenant Colonel Fedotov, decided that they had been sufficiently intimidated and gave instructions for them to be taken out to work. The center had supplied 125 pairs of brand new nickel-plated handcuffs, latest fascist design, just enough if you handcuffed them two together for 250 prisoners, which was probably how they had determined Kangir's allocation. With one free hand, life was not so bad. Quite a few of the lads in the column had experience of camp jails, and there were also old escapers among them too. Tenno, too, was included in the transport, who knew all the peculiarities of handcuffs, and explained to neighbors in the column that with one hand free, there was nothing to getting these cuffs off, with a pin or without one. When they got near the working area, the warders began removing handcuffs at several places in the column simultaneously, so as to start the day's work without delay, whereupon those who knew how hurriedly took off their own handcuffs and those of their prisoners, hid them under their coats. Another warder took ours off. It never occurred to the warders to count the handcuffs before they let the column pass. And prisoners were never searched on entering their place of work, so that on the very first morning, out of 125 pairs of handcuffs, our lads carried off 23. There in the work zone, they started smashing the cuffs with stones and hammers, but soon they had a brighter idea, wrapping them in greased paper so that they would last better, and bricking them up to the walls and foundations of the buildings on which they were working that day, residential block number 20, opposite the Kangir place of culture, together with ideologically uninhibited covering notes. Descendants, these houses were built by Soviet slaves. Here you see the sort of handcuffs they wore. The warders abused and cursed the bandits. They produced some rusty old cuffs for the return journey. They were very much on their guard now, but the lads still pinched another 6 pairs on the way into the camp. On each of the 2 following working days, they stole a few more, and every pair cost 93 rubles, so the bosses of Kangir declined to march the lads about in handcuffs. A man must fight for his rights. At about the beginning of May, they gradually started transferring the Akbatsu's group from the jail to the main camp. The time had come for them to teach the locals a little sense. At the beginning, they mounted a small demonstration. A trustee bargaining at the head of the queue, as was his right, was strangled, not quite fatally. This was enough to start people looking. Things are going to change around here. The new lot aren't like us. It would be untrue to say that in the nest of camps around Jezkazgan's stoolies had never been touched, but this had not become a trend. In 1951, in the jail at Rudnik, prisoners once snatched a warder's keys, unlocked the cell they wanted, and knifed Kozlovskis. Underground centers were now set up in Kangir, one Ukrainian, one all Russian. Knives and masks were made, ready for the chopping, and the whole story began all over again. Vojnilovich hanged himself from the bars of his cell. Others killed were the foreman, Bilokoput, and the loyalist stoolie, Lifshitz, a member of the Revolutionary Military Committee with the forces facing Dutov during the Civil War. Lifshitz had lived happily in the Rudnik Camp Division, where he was a librarian in the Culture and Education section, but his fame had preceded him, and he was killed the day after his arrival in Kangir. A Hungarian maintenance orderly was whacked to death with axes near the bathhouse. The first to flee and blaze a trail to the safe deposit was Sauer, former minister of Soviet Estonia. But by now, the camp bosses too knew what to do. For a long time past, there had been walls between the four camp divisions at Kangir. The idea was now to surround each hut with a wall of its own, and 8,000 men started working on it in their spare time. They also partitioned every hut into 4 sections, with no communication between them. Each miniature camp area and each new section was regularly locked. Ideally, of course, they would have liked to divide the whole world into one-man compartments. The sergeant major in charge of the Kangir jail was a professional boxer. He used prisoners as punching bags. In his jail, they had also invented a technique of beating prisoners with mallets through a layer of plywood so as to leave no marks. These practical MVD personnel knew that re-education was impossible without beatings and murders, and any practical public prosecutor would agree. But there was always the danger that some theorist might descend on them. It was this rather improbable visiting theorist who made the interposed plywood necessary. One Western Ukrainian, tortured beyond endurance and afraid that he might betray his friends, hanged himself. Others behaved worse, and both centers were put out of business. What is more, there were among the fighters some greedy rascals interested not in the success of the movement, but in feathering their nests. They wanted extra food brought to them from the kitchen, and a share in other prisoners' food parcels. This helped the authorities to discredit the movement and put a stop to it, or so they thought. But the stoolies, too, sank smaller after this first rehearsal. At least the atmosphere in Kangir was cleaner. The seed had been sown, but the crop would be late and a surprise. We are forever being told that individuals do not mold history, especially when they resist the course of progress. Before a quarter of a century, one such individual twisted our nails as if we were sheep, and we did not even dare to squeal. Now they say that nobody understood. The rear didn't understand. The vanguard didn't understand. Only the oldest of the old guard understood, and they chose to poison themselves in corners, shoot themselves in the privacy of their homes, or end their days as meek pensioners, rather than to cry out to us from a public platform. So the lot of the liberator fell on us little ones in Ekabat suits. By putting 5,000 pairs of shoulders under those prison vaults, heaving, we had at least caused a crack. Only a little one, perhaps, unnoticeable at a distance, and perhaps we had overstrained ourselves, but cracks make caves collapse. There were other disturbances besides ours, besides those in the special camps. The whole bloody past had been so carefully cleaned up and painted and polished that it was impossible for me now to establish even a bare list of disorders in the camps. I did learn by chance that in 1951, in the Vakushevko corrective labor camp at Sakhalin, 500 men were on hunger strike for 5 days, with excitement running high and selective arrests after 3 runaways had been savagely bayoneted outside the guardhouse. We know of a serious disturbance in Ozerlag on September 8, 1952, after a man had been killed in the ranks of the guardhouse. Evidently, the Stalinist camp system, particularly in the special camps, was nearing a crisis at the beginning of the 50s, even the Almighty One's lifetime. In the Almighty One's lifetime, the natives were beginning to tear at their chains. There is no knowing how things would have gone if he had lived. As it was, for reasons which had nothing to do with the laws of economics or society, the sluggish and impure blood suddenly stopped flowing in the senile veins of that undersized and pockmarked individual. According to the Vanguard doctrine, no change could have resulted from this, nor did the Blue Caps fear any change, though they wept outside the camp gates on March 5th, nor did the men in black jerkins dare to hope for change, though they strummed on their balalaikas. They were not let out of campgrounds that day, when they discovered that the funeral marches were being broadcast and that black bordered flags had been hung out. Yet some obscure convulsion, some slippage was started underground. True, the amnesty at the end of March 1953, known to the camps as the Voroshilov amnesty, was utterly faithful to the spiritual legacy of the deceased in its tenderness for thieves and its viciousness towards politicals. To curry favor with the underworld, the authors of the amnesty released the thieves upon the land like a plague of rats, leaving ordinary citizens to suffer, to bar their windows and make jails of their homes, and leaving the militia to hunt down all over again those it had ever caught, whereas the 58s were released in the normal ratio of 3,000 men. At number 2 Camp Division in Kankir, the number set free was 3. An amnesty like this could convince those in Katorga only one thing only, that Stalin's death had changed nothing. No mercy had ever been shown them, and it would not be shown now. If they wanted some sort of life on earth, they must fight for it. Disturbances in the camps continued. Minor brawls like that in Karlag, in various places in 1953, Camp Division number 12, and a major rebellion at Gorlag, Norilsk, about which a separate chapter would now follow, if we had any material at all, but there is none. However, the tyrant did not die in vain. Something hidden from view slipped and shifted, and suddenly, with a tinny clatter, like an empty bucket falling, yet another individual came tumbling headlong from the very top of the ladder into the muckiest of bogs. And now everyone, the vanguard, the rear, and even the most wretched natives of Gulag, realized that a new age had arrived. And now, to us on the archipelago, Barria's fall was like a thunderclap. He was the supreme patron, the viceroy of the archipelago, and VT officers were perplexed, embarrassed, dismayed when the news was announced over the radio. They would have liked to stuff this horror back into the loudspeaker, but had instead to lay hands on the portraits of their dear, kind prosecutor, take them down from the walls. Stepleg's headquarters. It's all over now, Colonel Ch11 said, with quivering lips, but he was mistaken. He thought that it would all be put on trial the very next day. He thought they would all be put on trial the very next day. The officers and warders suddenly showed an uncertainty, a bewilderment even, of which the camp prisoners were keenly aware. The disciplinary officer of Camp Division No. 3 at Kangaroo, from whom no prisoner had ever received a kind look, suddenly came up to a team from the disciplinary barracks while they were working, sat down, and started offering them cigarettes. He wanted to see what sparks were flying in that turbid atmosphere, and what danger could be expected from them. "What do you say to that, then?" they asked him mockingly. "Was your top boss really an enemy of the people?" "Yes, as it turns out." And the disciplinary officer said dolefully. "He was Stalin's right hand, though," said the maliciously grinning prisoners. "So that means even Stalin slipped up, doesn't it?" "Yes, even so yes," said the amiable chatterbox. "Well, lads, it looks as though they'll be letting you out, if you are patient." Beria had fallen, and he had bequeathed the blot of his name to his faithful organs. Until then, no prisoner, and no free man, if he valued his life, had dared even to think of doubting the crystalline purity of each and every MVD officer. But now it was enough to call one of these reptiles a Beriaite, and he was defenseless. In Resh Lake, Vorkuta, in June 1953, the great excitement caused by Beria's removal coincided with the arrival of the mutineers transported from Karaganda and Taishet. Most were Western Ukrainians. Vorkuta was still servile and downtrodden, and the newly arrived Czechs astounded the locals with their intransigence and their audacity. And the process that had taken us several long months was completed here in 1 month's time. On July 2nd, 1922, the Cement Works Building Project TETS-2 and the pits number 7, number 29, and number 6 struck. The prisoners at these work sites could see each other stopping work, see the wheels in the pit frames coming to a standstill. This time there was no repetition of our mistake at Ekbad-Sus, no hunger strike. The warders, to a man, immediately fled from the campgrounds. But every day, to the yells of "Hand over the rations, boss man," they trundled provisions up to the fence and shoved them through the gates. I suppose the fall of Beria had made them so conscientious, but for that they would have starved the prisoners out. The strike committees were set up in the camp divisions affected. Revolutionary order was established. The mess hall staff immediately stopped stealing, and although rations were not increased, the food improved noticeably. At pin number 7, they hung out a red flag, and at number 29, on the side facing a nearby railway line, they put up portraits of the Politburo. Where could they display? And what could they demand? They demanded that number patches, window bars, and locks be taken off, but touched none of these things themselves. They demanded the right to correspond, the right to receive visits, and a review of their cases. On the first day only, attempts were made to talk the strikers out of it. Then nobody came for near for a week, but machine guns were set up on the watchtowers, and the camp divisions on strike were cordoned off. No doubt the brass was scurrying back and forth between Vorkuta and Moscow, and it was hard to know what to do in the new circumstances. At the end of that week, General Maslenikov, the head of Reshleg, General Derivenko, and the Prosecutor General Rudenko started going around the camp with a large suite of officers, as many as 40. Everyone was assembled on the camp parade ground to meet his glittering train. The prisoners sat on the ground while the generals showered abuse on them for sabotage and disgraceful behavior. At the same time, they conceded that some of the demands are well-founded. You can take off all your number patches. Orders have been given about the window bars, but the prisoners must return to work at once. This country needs coal. At pit number 7, somebody shouted from the back, "And what we need is freedom, you dirty blank," and prisoners began to rise from the ground and disperse, leaving the generals with no audience. At this point they tore off number patches and began levering out the window bars. However, a schism immediately deployed, and their spirits fell. "Perhaps we've gone far enough. We can't get any more out of them," part of the night shift reported, and the whole day shift. The pit wheels started turning again, and the whole day shift. The pit wheels started turning again, and the various sites watched each other resume work. Pit 29, however, was behind a hill and could not see the others. It was told that all the rest had started work, but did not believe it and did not go back. It would obviously have been no trouble to take delegates from pit 29 over to the other pits, but to make any such fuss over prisoners would have been demeaning, and anyway, the generals were thirsting for blood. Without blood, there's no victory. Without blood, and these dumb brutes would never learn. On August 11th, 11 truckloads of soldiers drove up to pit 29. The prisoners were called out onto the parade ground toward the gate. On the other side of the gate, On the other side of the gate was a serried mass of soldiers. "Report for work, or we shall take harsh measures." "Never mind what measures. Just look at the Tommy guns." There was silence. Then the movement of human molecules in the cloud. Why risk your neck, especially if you have short sentence? Those with a year or two to go pushed their way forward. But there were others who forced a path through the ranks to stand in the front row, link arms, and form a barrier against the strikebreakers. The crowd was undecided. An officer tried to break the cordon and was struck with an iron bar. General Derivenko withdrew to one side and gave the order, "Fire," on the crowd. There were 3 volleys. With machine gun fire in between, 66 men were killed. Who were the victims? The front rows, that is to say, the most fearless, and also those who had weakened first. This is a law with a wide application. You will even find it expressed in Proverbs. The rest ran away. Guards with clubs and iron bars rushed after the Czechs, beating them and driving them out of camp. Arrests continued for 3 days, August 1st to 3rd, in all the camp divisions which had been on strike. But what could be done with those arrested? The organs had lost their cutting edge since the death of their breadwinner. They could not rise to a formal investigation. More special trains, more transfers hither and thither, and spread the epidemic more widely. The archipelago was becoming uncomfortably small. For those who were left behind, there was a special punitive regime. A number of thin wooden patches appeared on the roofs of huts at pit number 29, covering the bullet holes made by soldiers firing over the heads of the crowd, unknown soldiers who refused to become murderers. There were plenty of others who hit the target. Near the slag heap at pit 29, somebody in Khrushchev's day raised a cross with a tall stem like a telegraph pole on a communal grave. Then it was knocked down, and someone put it up again. I do not know whether it is still standing. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.